I think we'll get started. Is that standing too close to the mic? Wow, it's a standing room only crowd. It's fantastic. Thank you very much. We're here to showcase the Keystone projects. And as you have heard a number of times through the day, we make it a practice to acknowledge the lands that we stand on. So I'd like to start this event, Quest event, by acknowledging that we are on the beautiful, unceded and traditional territories of the Squamish peoples. And it's our pleasure to be here, for our university to be here, for us to experience our learning and living and playing on this land. The Keystones, what a wonderful time I'm sure you've had attending the talks. And this is a showcase of a range of Keystone projects that were selected to give you an appreciation for that. The range and diversity that's here. As you know, the Keystones represent a lot of work on everyone's part. And I'd like to thank, first of all, those who have arranged and made this event possible, Clara and the staff, the tutors, the students, the parents, all of you who have contributed your part in making today's event possible. So thank you very much for that. Precisely 103 Keystone projects were submitted. 11 were selected for something called distinction. And there's a panel of people who make this selection. And I'd like to read to you the names of the people and the projects who were selected for distinction. Kaylin Pritchard, The Emergence of the Tangent Function in European Trigonometry. Molly Hamilton, That's the Way It's Always Been Done. Nostalgia, Surprise, and Epistemologies of Ignorance at a Boy Scouts of America Camp. Catherine Luckman, Tragedy Plus Time. The Benefits of Barriers to and Future of Performing Local Stand-Up Comedy as Told by the Women of Southern Oregon. Emily Bison, Is Your Makeup Toxic? The Toxicity of Personal Care Products and Institutions that Reinforce the Status Quo. Josie Bowman, On Track, Off Track. A photographic exploration of identity and legitimacy in roller derby subculture. Valerie Fowles, Investigating the Role of Carbon Capture Research in a Carbon-Constrained World, an Interdisciplinary Trilogy. Aina Yasue, We Are, Humanizing the Immigrant Body Through the Hip-Hop Appropriation. Lexis Kepler, Investigating the Pathogenicity of Autism Spectrum Disorder-Associated Mutations within C. elegans. Liliana Weimer, Back Over the Range to the Golden Gate, using 19th century travel writing to understand the modern American West. Sophie Reiner, Competing Histories, Continued Conflict, Framing Analyses of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict as Described in High School History Texts. And Nicole Zanesco, Poles of Contention, Polar Governance as a Path Towards Peace. So those titles give you an appreciation again of the diversity that is here. This Keystone exercise, a project we go through, really, perhaps I was going to say stress you, but pulls you forward in your best efforts towards a focused project. It also highlights a very important part of our tutors. Our tutors are excellent teachers. They facilitate learners like no one else. But they also are outstanding scholars. And these areas often represent areas in which they are experts with whom they engage students. Students participate, write papers together with them, publish with them. But most of all, they pay attention to your interests. Those of our students who come to Quest and are privileged to have this opportunity to pursue what you want, the way you want it, with some of the best people in the world. So I'll hand the program over to Andrew Hamilton, who will guide us through the rest of the program. Dr. Hamilton.
Thank you very much, George. So before we get started, I just want to mention a few logistical notes in case it hasn't been clear to anybody. We have 6 presentations today, each 15 minutes long. There will be a few questions after each presentation, and time permitting, we will take a brief break after the 3rd presentation. Before we get on with the sessions, just want to remind everybody to turn off any noise-making devices. As everybody reaches into their pocket, did I turn it off? With that, our first presentation, our first presenter is Molly Hamilton. Molly spent a summer doing ethnographic research at a Boy Scout camp, Boy Scouts of America camp. Let's welcome Molly.
The song you just heard, Dixieland, was originally performed in northern minstrel shows by white people in blackface. During the Civil War, it became the de facto national anthem of the Confederacy. While the catchy tune of Dixieland recalls nostalgic images of the American South, as many scholars and Black Americans have pointed out, Dixie is really about the Civil War and slavery. The upbeat melody and euphemistic language of the song obscures the fact that its lyrics, "I wish I was in the land of cotton, old times there are not forgotten," express a nostalgic longing for slave times. The voices singing this particular rendition of Dixieland belong to the staff of a Boy Scouts of America wilderness camp, the site where I conducted 8 weeks of ethnographic research during the summer of 2018. Every week at this camp, which I have fictitiously named Camp Sitka, the entire staff would gather in the campfire bowl to perform American Heritage, a show about American history whose text excluded information about slavery and colonization in favor of preserving a selective, nostalgic story of American goodness, superiority, and ingenuity. In my Keystone, I argue that the nostalgic longing for the old times in idyllic Dixieland is made possible through the strategic omission of any explicit mention of slavery, indexed here in the euphemism of the land of cotton. In other words, what we are looking away from is slavery and white violence. In the next 12 minutes, I'll make the argument that Dixieland is one example of how, at Camp Sitka, nostalgically remembering the American past required collectively forgetting histories of violence against marginalized people, namely Native and African Americans. But first, let's back up a bit. The Boy Scouts of America, or BSA, is one of the largest youth organizations in the United States and has served as a profound socializing force for boys since its founding in 1910. Despite the massive influence of this quintessential American institution, there is surprisingly little ethnographic work on the BSA. It was this lacking in research, paired with the BSA's recent decision to admit girls into their traditional program for the first time, that motivated my desire to conduct research on the ground during the last summer that the BSA would be open only to male campers. Having grown up alongside my brother and father, both Eagle Scouts, I was also interested in thinking more critically about an organization that had hugely impacted my family members and had peripherally shaped my own life. After reaching out to several camps in the western United States, I was hired as the waterfront director at Camp Sitka and arranged to conduct ethnographic research while living and working at camp. On June 15th, 2018, I began my work in the dry pine forest of Camp Sitka, a militaristic and hypermasculine cowboy camp where idyllic images of white, middle-class, 1950s America seemed to come alive. As the camp director satirically recounted to me in an interview, Camp Sitka was known for being, quote, the best camp, the best staff, because they were that model of being all-American boys, clean-cut, strong, white, tan, blonde hair, blue eyes, all that good stuff. To make sense of how this particular camp environment reproduced normative narratives about masculinity and whiteness in the western United States, I conducted 10 in-depth qualitative interviews with adult leaders at camp. I also recorded ethnographic field notes based on what I observed in my position as both researcher and employee. As the summer and my research progressed, I started to notice patterns, not only in what was present in the discourse of staff members and in camp programming, but also what was absent. Despite the fact that female and male staff members were segregated into housing units that differed markedly in quality, there was essentially no discussion around this sexist tradition. During our weekly performance of American Heritage, there was no mention of colonization, slavery, or other ugly parts of American history. And every week, when non-native men dressed up in faux indigenous regalia to perform as Indians in a racist and appropriative Order of the Arrow ceremony, there was no outcry, nor, to my knowledge, any actual Native Americans in the ceremonies. How do we explain these absences? And what did these absences have to do with the persistence of oppressive programming at Camp Sitka? In my Keystone, I show that these gaps, or absences, are more productively read as the presence of ignorance. Whereas ignorance is usually thought of as a lack of knowledge, I draw on theories that frame ignorance as a type of knowledge production in itself, to argue that gaps at Camp Sitka weren't accidental or random. Rather, the kind of not knowing that circulated here was actively produced and reproduced in both camp programming and staff discourse. I argue that this reproduction of ignorance helped to sustain patterns of violence and inequity by ultimately insulating these systems from meaningful critique. This brings us back to Dixieland and American Heritage. Recall how earlier I made the argument that Dixieland is one example of how practices at Camp Sitka that nostalgically remembered the American past were made possible through the forgetting or absence of information on histories of white violence. There are other examples of this in the American Heritage Program besides just Dixieland. The language around the settling of the western United States, for instance, is told through romanticized depictions of Western settlers who are framed in the program as a people with the determination to survive and the willingness to endure. These narratives erase or forget the violent displacement of Native peoples, instead centering settlers' courage and determination despite the hardship of frontier life. Nostalgically remembering the settling of the West requires that we forget the violence and trauma of colonization and, in fact, forget Native Americans entirely. By actively reproducing ignorance about America's bloody racial history, we fail to make space for alternative presents and alternative futures. Mythologies, like those of Dixieland and American heritage, set the stage for history to keep on repeating and repeating and repeating itself. So at this point in the story, I'm guessing that some of you may be thinking, wow, this camp seems pretty messed up. Or, I can't believe that people are still singing a song that wistfully remembers slavery in 2018. And you'd be feeling something I felt for much of my time at Camp Sitka: surprise, shock, or disbelief. To this day, when I recount stories from camp, one of the most common responses I receive is the question, were you surprised by what you found? I've spent the last 6 months pondering this very question and the subsequent questions that it inspired. What is surprise? Who is surprised? By what? And what does surprise do? Rather than associate ignorance only with more conservative and oppressive communities, as is generally the case in the literature on ignorance, I theorize in my Keystone that more progressive staff members' shock, surprise, or disbelief about perceived injustice at camp is also an expression of ignorance. So I'll unpack this theoretical argument a bit more. On a purely logical level, surprise reveals ignorance. If I'm surprised to hear or learn about something, it means that I didn't know about it before, or I didn't have prior knowledge that would lead me to expect something to happen. Surprise thus acts as a kind of mirror for ignorance, or what we don't know. This ignorance isn't always political. For instance, I might be surprised if my grandmother dyed her hair blue, and that wouldn't really reveal any kind of systemic or institutionalized ignorance on my part. However, when large numbers of white Americans express surprise or disbelief about racist police brutality, an issue that Black Americans have been bringing attention to and resisting for many decades, this reflects systemic white ignorance towards ongoing racial discrimination, and this kind of ignorance is political. White reactions of shock and surprise about racism can indicate how white people are taught to view the world through a white racial frame, which conditions us to presume white superiority, virtue, and innocence. This belief in white moral goodness, of course, cannot be maintained without the continuous forgetting of white violence, and thus reveals how whites see the world through an epistemology of ignorance. So how did this connection between surprise and ignorance actually manifest at Camp Sitka? Throughout the summer, staff members who identified as more ideologically progressive or critical, such as myself, often expressed shock towards oppressive practices at camp. Consider this passage from my own ethnographic field notes, which contains my reaction to witnessing a racist and appropriative Order of the Arrow ceremony. As the canoes came closer, I began to see the outlines of feathers on one man's head. No, 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 I said quietly. I think I said it out loud. I kind of knew this was coming, but to see it actually happen, to see this white man in a headdress coming out of the fog in a canoe and step onto shore, I thought, I can't believe this is actually happening. Now, I went into my work at Camp Sitka knowing very well that I would witness these kinds of appropriative racial mimicry practices. My persistent shock, then, may reflect my own ingrained investment in the idea of white moral goodness, my own epistemology of ignorance, so that when confronted with white violence in person, my response was to deny my reality. I can't believe this is actually happening. I wasn't the only one to respond to injustice at Camp Sitka in this manner. Many of the camp staff that I interviewed expressed sentiments like, I just can't wrap my head around what went so wrong here. It's crazy. And I'm just a little stunned, speaking about American heritage. While these are certainly valid feelings, these kinds of responses to injustice often had the effect of paralyzing people within disbelief, rather than mobilizing them to respond. Furthermore, people's surprise and inability to explain things that they didn't agree with meant that things like Dixieland, American heritage, and the Order of the Arrow ceremonies persisted as strange, unusual, and bizarre phenomenon. Instead, I suggest that these types of racist revisionary histories and patterns of appropriation are common and predictable within white supremacist society. Thus, because people's surprise and disbelief prevented them from linking individual phenomenon with larger structures of domination, patterns of violence and inequity continued largely unaddressed and unchecked. I was shocked by the fact that camp staff were singing Dixieland in 2018. I was shocked by many things about Camp Sitka, as were other more critical staff members. But since concluding my fieldwork, I've thought more about what it means for me and others at camp to be surprised or shocked by these types of injustice. After all, if you just can't believe something, you run the risk not only of denying the reality that's in front of you, but also divorcing that phenomenon from the very real reasons that produced it in the first place. If you find what I presented to you today shocking, I'd urge you to walk away thinking not only about Dixieland and the Order of the Arrow, but about patterns of erasure and appropriation, patterns of revisionary history, patterns of violence, inequity, and discrimination. Camp staff may be singing Dixieland somewhere out there in the woods, but the same systems of power are operating all around us all the time. The more we notice this, the less surprising it becomes, and hopefully, the more prepared we are to do something about it. Thank you.
Very much. And now we have time for a few questions.
Yep.
What led you to Camp Sitka specifically?
Kind of just chance. I was interested in living somewhere where my partner and family were located, and I reached out to camps in that area. I actually initially reached out to do my experiential learning, or basically volunteer with a BSA camp. And at this point in the year, they were hiring, and they said, actually, you're great for waterfront director. How about you just apply for a job? So I did, and I ended up living there and working there for 2 months full-time. Yeah. Yes.
I don't suppose you're going back next summer?
Great experience, would recommend. I do not think that I'll be going back to Camp Sitka specifically, but I do foresee doing more work with scouting in general. I'm hoping to potentially pursue my PhD and continue doing this kind of work because I find it really fascinating. I think the BSA is a really fascinating site of different intersecting power relations and histories, and yeah, I find it endless fascinating. Yeah.
I don't know if this is a fair analogy, but at this juncture, where you were there when it was all men or boys, and now it's going to be girls, and the analogy that comes to mind is the similar transition that happened in the military that hasn't gone so smoothly. Your experience, especially being a woman there, what do you foresee?
Yeah, so the question was with girls being admitted into the BSA, what kinds of things do I foresee? So just to be clear, the BSA has been open to women in the capacity of staff and in their venturing program before. So me working as a woman was not a first. But girls being open to advance to the rank of Eagle is new as of this February. And initially I wrote a lot about gender and sexuality dynamics on the ground at camp, and certainly being a woman I experienced what that was like firsthand. I think a really important thing to think about moving forward with having girls in the organization is not only logistics, which is mainly what I heard my interviewees talk most about, like building new bathrooms and having separate sides of camp or whatever. I think those things are maybe important, but the way more important thing is, what does it mean to admit girls into the BSA, a program which has been designed for boys and is quite a hypermasculine space. So I think I'd like to see more people thinking explicitly about what does it mean to change the social landscape of this organization so that girls are actually welcome here.
Let's thank Molly one more time. Oh, Molly. Thank you very much, Molly. Our second presenter is Lexis Kepler. Lexi has spent the better part of the last year understanding the genetic origins of autism. The research she has conducted is not yet published. So I'd like to ask you, if you do decide to photograph or film any of her presentation, please do not distribute it publicly. Our third presenter is Maximilian Kahn. Maximilian is here to teach us about neural networks. Please welcome Maximilian.
Thank you, everyone. The point of this presentation is for you to be able to walk out that door feeling like you have more of an intuition for how neural networks are both structured and how they are trained. For those who are curious, this image in the background was created using a neural network that has been trained to essentially output psychedelic artwork. The classic example of where neural networks are used are autonomous cars. And so the video in front of you right now is of Autonomous, which is the self-driving car created by the University of Waterloo's Intelligent Systems Engineering Lab. So on the top of Autonomous are a set of 9 cameras that basically take video of the environment around the car. And paired with those cameras is a neural network that is able to classify objects within the video. And so, for example, the neural network will classify objects such as trees, sidewalks, roads, people, houses, so on and so forth. Now, I would like to say that Autonomous represents the state of the art in terms of autonomous driving, but actually I think that title has to go to Tesla, who in a very exciting press conference held last Monday, essentially announced that they have created the world's first fully self-driving car. And so that's playing right now. And so what they basically said is that maybe as early as next year, we may have fully self-driving cars on the road. Now, okay, I'm personally a little skeptical of this. I don't think it'll be next year. But even if it's in the next 2 to 3 years, this is much sooner than a lot of us would have expected. I personally was thinking maybe in the next 9 to 10 years, maybe in the next 20 years, not in the next 2 to 3 years. And so this is quite exciting. Another area where neural networks are used quite a bit is in the realm of facial recognition. And here China is actually a world leader. And so in China, they have a vast network of over 200 million surveillance cameras. And so these cameras are basically paired with neural networks that, as you can see, can classify people off of how you look. And so in particular, China is interested in keeping tabs on certain kinds of people. So for example, if you're registered as a criminal, if you're mentally ill, or if you're a Uyghur, which is the Muslim minority group in China. So the reason why I raised these 2 examples is basically to highlight that neural networks are not just a load of theoretical computer science mumbo-jumbo. They are being used and implemented in society as we speak. And I personally think that they will have a huge impact on how society functions. And so therefore, it's probably a good idea that we have at least a rough intuition for how they work. So the first thing we're going to look at is the structure of neural networks. And so how I conceptualize these networks are basically as input-output machines. And so, for example, here we have an input layer, and the idea is we would feed an input, maybe like an image, for example, through the input layer, and then some calculations happen here, and then the output layer would output the answer. So maybe it's a classification. So maybe, let's say we input an image of a dog, then the output would be the word dog. So, to get, I should also mention one quick thing. There's a little bit of linguistic confusion here, actually, because here I mentioned the input layer has 2 neurons, and the output layer has 1 neuron. But when I say neuron, I don't mean cells in your brain neuron. I mean artificial neuron. And how I conceptualize artificial neurons are basically nodes in a network that take on number values. And so to get an intuition for that, let's look at the example of a simple fruit classifier neural networks. And so this thing is going to basically classify apples from oranges. So let's label apples 1, let's label oranges 0. And let's say our neural network is going to take in 2 attributes of the fruit. It's going to look at the sugar content of the fruit, and it's going to look at the width of the fruit. So let's say we choose a random apple. We measured its sugar content to be 6 grams. We measured its width to be 2.5 inches, and we're going to feed that value through. And if our neural network is properly trained, it's going to output 1, basically. And that is the rough intuition behind the workflow of the neural network. So some other interesting properties of the neural network are the weights and the threshold values. And the weights, you can basically think of them as the strength of the connection between the neurons. And so here, for example, the weight 1 is a stronger connection than the weight 2. The threshold value is attached to the output neuron, and it basically represents, it's a quantifier for how hard it is for the output neuron to take on large values. And so we will return to those ideas in just a little bit. But first, let's talk about how we actually calculate the output. And so it's actually quite simple. It's just the first weight times the first input, plus the second weight times the second input, plus the threshold value. But this doesn't really tell us, okay, so what actually is the neural network computing here? And so to get that intuition, let's remove the second term. So we're just left with the first weight times the first input plus the threshold. And notice here that the first weight is actually just a number of some sort, times some input variable, and then plus the threshold, which is just another number. So I'm going to relabel this as mx plus b, where m is just some number, x is an input variable, and b is also just another number. And lo and behold, this is just the equation of a line, as it turns out. And actually, it doesn't change the fact that if we add in the second term, it doesn't change the fact that the output is linear. And so let's conceptualize this with our fruit example. Okay? So we're going to plot apples and oranges off of their sugar content and their width. And basically what our neural network is doing is plotting this line here. And it's saying everything above the line, I'm going to label as an orange. Everything below the line, I'm going to label as an apple. But notice here, we have a bunch of apples that are currently classified as oranges. So it turns out a line is actually not a great way to classify these fruits. Instead, what we want is something more curvaceous, something along the lines of this. And notice here that this curve does actually a pretty great job of having all the oranges on the top and all the apples at the bottom. And so the idea is here, we don't want our neural network to be a linear output. We want it to be, but we want it to have a non-linear output. And so how do we get it to be this curve instead of a line? Well, what's going to save us is the sigmoid curve. And notice here the sigmoid curve is quite nonlinear. And so the first question that you may ask is, why is it called the sigmoid curve? And the reason why it's called the sigmoid curve is because it comes from the lowercase Greek letter sigma, which sort of looks like an S, I suppose. And also the sigmoid curve also sort of looks like an S. And so there you go. Now, the intuition behind the sigmoid curve is basically, it caps the output of our neural network at 1. So notice here, if you have a very large input, the maximum value is going to be near 1. It also means that if the input is very negative, the output is going to be close to 0. And so those are some interesting properties of the sigmoid curve. So let's return to the output. How do we actually calculate the output? Well, it's what we previously had as the output, and we're going to feed that in, we shall feed that into the sigmoid curve, basically. So How about the weights? So recall that the weights represent how strong the connection is between the input and output neurons. So, for example, here we see that when we move from a weight of 2 to a weight of 8, we see that the sigmoid curve becomes much steeper. And this kind of aligns with the idea that the weight represents the strength of the connection. So notice that if the weight is 2, we need an input value near 1.5 to get an output near 1. Whereas if the weight is 8, this is basically the strength of the connection between the input and output neuron is quite large. And so we only need an input value near 0.5. How about the threshold? So you can see here that the threshold essentially represents how hard it is for the output neuron to activate. And you can see what it does is it basically shifts the curve. So if the threshold is 0, it's over here, and if we ramp it up to 3, we shift the curve right. And so when the threshold is 0, we need an input value near about 1.6, but to get an output near 1. Whereas if we ramp it up to 3, we now need an input value of around 3.4. And so basically it raises the threshold, in a sense. Okay, so how do we actually train our neural network? And here the most important thing is the cost. Now, the cost is defined as the output of the neural network minus the correct label of the input squared. And this is actually quite intuitive, because this is just, if the output of the neural network is equal to the correct label, then the cost is 0. But the output of the neural network is very different from the correct label, then the cost is going to be quite high. So let's return to our example of classifying fruits. So remember that apples are labeled 1, oranges are labeled 0. And let's say we have an untrained neural network here. And let's measure a random apple. And we measured its sugar content to be 5 grams, is with to be 2 inches, and we're going to feed that through. And lo and behold, our neural network misclassifies our apple as an orange. So what's the cost here? The cost in this case is the output of the neural network, which is 0, minus the correct label, which is 1. And so the cost is 1. And this gets at the crux of how we train our neural network. The idea is we want to minimize the cost by changing the weights in the threshold value. So that's exactly what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to change the weights in the threshold, and now it's a trained neural network. And so when we feed the apple through the network, we get a 1. And so what's the cost in this case? Well, the cost is just 1 minus 1, which is 0. So to recap, to train your neural network, the main intuition is we want to minimize the cost by changing the weights and the threshold values. And the idea is that if you do this not just across one apple, but across many apples and oranges, you will end up with quite a good fruit classifier. Now, of course, I wasn't really interested in classifying apples from oranges. I was interested in another problem, classifying images from 0 to 9, basically. A much more interesting task. And this is the neural network I was using. So it's slightly larger than what we've been working with. This has 994 neurons compared to the 3 that we've been looking at. This also has 89,400 weights compared to the 2 that was in the previous model. But nonetheless, the same intuitions apply here. So in this case, how I train this network, I'm still trying to minimize the cost, not across apples and oranges, but across images of numbers. And so the last thing I want to talk about is basically how do I actually feed in images through this network. And so each image is 28 by 28 pixel values. And each pixel has a value between 0 and 1, where 0 represents a black pixel and 1 represents a white pixel. And between that, from 0 to 1 are gray pixels, basically. And the idea is we're going to take the first row of 28 pixels, and we're going to feed that into the first 28 neurons. And so 28 by 28 pixels means there's 784 values in total. And so there's 784 pixel values, there's 784 neurons, and so you get the idea. But we're assigning each neuron a value. And so we're going to feed in our image number 1. We're going to propagate that value through the network. And if our network has been properly trained, which let's assume it has been, then it's going to output a list looking like this, sort of. And so the idea is, how do we interpret this output? Well, we want to look at the maximum value. So here the maximum value is 0.9. And what this tells us is, we want to look at the position of this maximum value, and that tells us the classification. So in this case, you can see this top number here represents 0. This second, this number here represents 1. And And so we're going to look at this maximum value. It's at position 1. And so that means the classification is 1. Now, using this neural network, I achieve an accuracy of 98%, which is not bad, but actually this paper, written in 1998, also achieves that number. This was written 21 years ago. So my Keystone is really not, it's really not pushing forward novel research results in that frame. But nonetheless, the point of my Keystone was not to push for new research results. It was actually to write up a way for that someone, if they just know a little bit of mathematics, can create their very own neural network from scratch. And so the idea is that if you can start from the basics, once you know the basics, you can basically work up and you can work on harder problems like autonomous driving. And indeed, now that I've worked on my Keystone, I'm moving forward and working on a slightly harder problem. I will actually be working at the University of Waterloo's Intelligent Systems Engineering Lab over this summer and the next 2 years, working on autonomous and its neural network system. Thank you very much.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Okay, over there.
Max, I'm curious, did you test your Keystone on people that know math but maybe not a lot of programming to see if they could actually do it?
Yes, actually, I just got a recent request to read it by Nora, who is actually in the linear algebra class. I don't know, yes, Nora right there, yes. And said that it worked okay, I guess. Thank you. Yes.
If neural networks are unable to achieve 100% accuracy, then how reasonable is it to assume we can rely on autonomous vehicles?
Well, I think you can rely on autonomous vehicles because they'll have many checks in place. It won't just be neural networks. I've actually only covered one of the systems for these autonomous cars. But these autonomous cars actually have quite a few safety checks in place. It's not just the cameras actually, as it turns out. And so it's not just if a neural network fails to work, it's just it's going to crash into a wall. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question about the training process.
Sure.
You mentioned in the information for cost, it was the correct label was in there, so you needed to know what the correct label was. So that means somewhere along the line you need a human who knows the answer.
It's a good question. So basically the question is, if we need to, if in the training process we essentially need to have a labeled set of data, would that not mean we need a human in the process? And yes, and yes, the answer is yes.
Just a quick comment. The third author in that paper that you cited
Yes.
won the Nobel Prize equivalent for artificial intelligence earlier this year. It's a professor at the University of Montreal, runs a $50 million AI lab. So given that you were able to duplicate that result as an undergraduate student, well, it's a lot of promise for you and all the best of you.
Thank you very much, Maximilian. Our next presenter, Mathias Horne. Mathias has spent his last 4 years at Quest, also working at the Odin Art Museum in Whistler. He has interrogated his relationship with nature through art. Please welcome Mathias.
Okay, we're good. Is it human nature to revel in the environment while also participating in its destruction? I remember as a child the joy of hiking and up-close encounters with different wildlife. While I also remember the joy of playing in the soil, building dams and forts, only really to get the satisfaction of later destroying them. These experiences and observations of how both I and others were changing our natural surroundings captured my attention. What is a meaningful connection to nature? How is that connection obstructed? These questions have been supported by my academic pursuits here at Quest University, but became especially crucial during my experiential learning to Antarctica in 2017. During this time, I got the privilege to study alongside polar scientists and witness unique encounters with different marine life. The footage you are seeing here was gathered by Ari Freelander and his team and captures one of the most amazing experiences I've ever been a part of. Antarctica was unforgettable, but furthermore, it is one of the most rapidly changing ecosystems on the planet today due to human-induced climate change. After this trip, I truly learned and understood what was at stake and felt a call to action. Every day, vast areas of our natural surroundings fall to bulldozers and chainsaws in the name of progress. We have been told this is a crisis that needs to be addressed, for our failure might result in a once thriving planet becoming nothing but wastelands stained by our greed. We are drawn by a desire, a chance at good living, yet we are consciously or unconsciously aware that the world is suffering for our success. What will we pass to our future generations, and how can we educate them on what has happened to our natural surroundings? It wasn't until working at the Auditing Art Museum in Whistler that I realized how impactful artworks could be at conveying stories and emotions specifically around the environment. Through helping design exhibitions and tours, I was introduced to different artists focusing on biodiversity and urban environments, really questioning how their perspectives are conveyed throughout their work. Two artists that heavily influenced my artistic practice and the creation of my Keystone project are Nick Brandt and Edward Bertinsky. Both artists primarily use the medium of photography and create dialogue around humanity's global footprint. Through monochromatic wildlife portraiture and panoramic series, Nick Brandt captures different endangered species and their changing habitats, specifically in Eastern Africa. His work has a sense of intimacy that allows the viewer to gain a glimpse into the lives of these different affected species. And by combining industrialized backdrops and wildlife portraiture, Brandt's images capture both the beauty and the crisis of endangerment. And by presenting his images in black and white, there's a unique emotional quality, giving his portraits the illusion that they are classical and regal. This level of connection and encapsulation is something that I strive to achieve throughout my own work, through similar focal techniques, perspectives, and monochromatic style. Edward Bertinsky can be seen as someone who captures industrial encroachment and shifting natural patterns. Seen as a contemporary photographer, Bertinsky is known for his use of aerial perspective, with an emphasis on composition. His images are textured, cluttered, and abstracted, yet depict familiar landscapes that become unfamiliar from a new perspective and angle. Bertinsky's work makes places of devastation look evocative and beautiful. Aerial shots from around the globe capture different bodies of water, glaciers, quarries, rivers, and urban settings. Bertinsky's work, perspective, and way of finding and capturing unique and narrative-rich properties has heavily influenced the imagery and mentality which I chose to focus my Keystone around. After getting the chance to personally meet Edward Bertinsky at his private exhibition opening, we had an impactful conversation about his work and how it was understood. Part of my role while working at the Auditing was to develop children's programs around the permanent and temporary exhibitions. So our conversation immediately went to how children see and understand artwork. We both shared experiences that when children at the ages around 7 to 9 not only could understand Bertinsky's work, but could share complex narratives about the imagery that they were seeing. such as the catastrophe of the Deepwater Horizon spill, or the sheer amounts of fresh water used in pivot irrigation systems. After having such a connection with a world-renowned artist, I found that my own artistic practice shifted from purely aesthetic representation to visual storytelling, where I'm now more focused on my audience and how I can incorporate an educational component. This resulted in the work of my Keystone. My process begins with reference. Being out in the field, photography is the first step. I like to choose imagery that is temporary, subtle, and often overlooked, and put it in the spotlight to bring attention to different environments that are harmed by our contemporary routines. Through the process of representing different landscapes, illustration gave me the creative freedom to depict reality with ease. Drawing is a form of meditation for me. It calms my mind and allows me to break down complex representations into lines and shapes. In this illustration, it is through breaking down my subjects to a silhouette that we see the comparison between the birds and the plane. And by playing with perspective and our sense of depth, the plane at first glance might look like another bird within the flock. On average, each illustration takes me about, well, as you can see, like 10 seconds, which is actually more like 6 to 10 hours, as I put an emphasis on contrast, perspective, and realism. My entire collection has been consciously curated in black and white, which essentially is a timeless aspect that imagery in color just doesn't quite capture. The goal is for my collection to create an impression that the collection may be depicting an earlier time period, and that my illustrations and the narratives within them are of places and species that are already long gone. I focus heavily on contrast. I display two elements together, one being the natural and the other the industrial, but the elements and shapes of both are so similar that by only using black and white, some scenes oppose a sense of perplexity as machinery and nature blend together as one. In this illustration, the excavator's arm is represented by the surrounding forest and tree branches. So by abstracting my subjects, I choose to leave the viewer looking closer to puzzle together that juxtaposition and single narrative in each page. Each image has been consciously created to be viewed through the perspective of human eyes. Grounded and situated, the viewer is presented with different imagery of looking up, down, and across the many landscapes I depicted. The integration of a blur effect provides me with the power to guide the viewer's focus and control how and where they look within my artwork. The focal point is integral to my narrative. There is a continuous fluctuation between the industrial and the natural being in focus. My collection starts with imagery surrounding more nature-dominant scenes and eventually transitions to that of industrial-dominant scenes as the book or collection progresses. This progression is to further communicate the transitioning state of our planet due to humanity's continuous resource extraction and consumption. While being presented with imagery of natural destruction, it is not uncommon for the viewer to be repulsed or angered. However, there seems to be beauty in the places where you least expect it. While exploring such imagery that showcases the destruction of life, I found myself puzzled at the fact that something such as electrical towers, cranes, excavators, and even factories to have such beauty to their structure. There seems to be almost a unique play of seduction and repulsion revolving around certain scenes in my collection, leaving both myself and the viewer questioning classical notions of both beauty and destruction. Whether my medium is illustration or acrylic paint, I hope my artwork communicates that we are all implicit in the changes that are being made to our natural surroundings. I aim to cultivate dialogue around both the beauty and the sadness at hand. And by drawing in an emotional aspect, I hope to leave the viewer with a new perspective about how they interact with their own natural systems. My goal is also for my artworks to give back to different organizations that are consciously making an effort in the lives of different affected species. such as the painting beside me, which helps supports the Grizzly Bear Foundation of Canada. The world is not black and white, and there are no clear answers to the problems our environments face. I see my artwork in Keystone Project as documentation and a critique of our current industrialized society, thus creating necessary dialogue around how our development is not only changing our surroundings, but as well as ourselves. I would like to extend my appreciation to Dr. Jamie Kemp, Dr. Curtis Collins, Amar Hark-Weber, my friends and family, the Auditing Art Museum, and the Grizzly Bear Foundation of Canada for the endless support throughout this project. Thank you.
We have time for a couple questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know you grew up here, and I think Squamish is like a crazy place where the natural and the industrial world overlap all the time. And I'm wondering if you, as a person who has like so much relationship with this place, just can talk to like a few of the physical spaces in this corridor that strike you as like really good examples of where we see the natural and the industrial world collide.
Totally. So the question was about how I grew up here in Squamish and the imagery that I see around here and how that influenced my work.
Yeah, or just like if there are specific.
And if there are specific locations?
All of that stuff.
Yeah, so I can, why don't we go back? Let's go back. So this one here at the beginning is kind of relating to how sound and how even that idea that when we look out, it becomes more familiar, the imagery that we're seeing, that mix between the natural and the industrial. So this image is relating to how sound and how the mill across the way, wood fiber is something that's so small, but yet displays something so large when we look out there. And also, if even here at Quest, we've noticed such a change in how our view of our natural surroundings has changed so much. So that imagery is becoming more and more familiar, even here in Squamish.
Yeah, I had a real response around kind of fairy tales, and I wonder, because you work with children who spoke about that age, time frame, I wonder if that's intentional or just maybe it's evoked for you as the artist.
Totally. So the question was relating to how my artwork is almost fairy tale-like and has kind of almost a children's aesthetic to it, and that is totally intentional. So the original idea for my Keystone project was to create a children's book, actually, and to kind of create children's literature that's surrounding just the environmental impacts that we're seeing. And so I'm hoping to actually get this published later on this year, and I'm looking for a body of work to accompany it with that to kind of broaden the horizons of children's literature. Thank you. Last question? One more question?
Yeah. This is not appropriate, so I apologize. Are you selling that painting?
Can I turn this into an auction?
Thank you very much, Mathias. Our next presenter is Martin Lentz. Martin spent many days conducting field research on the unique alpine lakes found in the Garibaldi Provincial Park just above us. Let's welcome Martin.
So, as Andrew just mentioned, I completed my Keystone research doing fieldwork in Garibaldi Provincial Park on Garibaldi Lake. Now, many of you may be familiar with Garibaldi Lake because of the picturesque landscape, the stunning blue waters, or maybe you just heard a presentation on it about it last year. But the other reason that you may have heard about Garibaldi Lake is it's described around town as this ticking time bomb, this looming lake that's going to come crashing down onto us here in town. Now, we're going to get into that a little bit more. But for those of you that aren't familiar with Garibaldi Lake, it's located about 20 kilometers north of here on the way up to Whistler. And I just want to say, Garibaldi Lake is absolutely massive. It's 10 square kilometers and has a maximum depth of over 270 meters. For the Americans in the room, that's over 800 feet deep. Now, when we talk about the Garibaldi Lake system, we're referring to Garibaldi Lake, the big lake, as well as Lesser Garibaldi and Barrier Lake. These three lakes are held back by a natural dam that we call the barrier here. And this is where the hazard comes in. So I want to say right now that the hazard isn't from this entire dam collapsing, sending all that water rushing into Squamish. While that may be possible on a geologic timescale, on a human timescale, that isn't our big concern. Our concern on a human timescale comes from large landslides coming off of this big cliff face down into the valley and affecting our lives. Landslides have occurred off the barrier in the past. In 1856, there was a landslide of 25 million cubic meters of rock that came down. If we had that today, it would come here from the barrier, take out Highway 99 and the Daisy Lake Hydro Project, which then could cause a flood that would affect us here in the Squamish Valley. So now, why is this lake so dangerous? Where does this hazard come from? Basically, what's going on is these lakes drain out of their lake bottoms. They leak out of the bottom, and the water comes rushing out at the base of the barrier. Now, you don't need to be an engineer to understand that having a bunch of water rushing out of the bottom of your dam isn't going to be very good for it, unless, of course, you designed it to be like that. So now, it's important to point out that we don't know exactly how this system works. We don't know how water is moving through this system, and we don't have a good idea of the quantity of water that's moving through this system. So in order for us to better understand this hazard, we need to first better understand how this system was formed. Once we understand how this system was formed, then we can think about the hazard. So for now, we're going to put the hazard aside. We'll return to it later. But right now, I just want to nerd out about some cool rock stuff. So this is an aerial image, or a satellite image actually, of the Garibaldi Lake system. And about 10,000 years ago, there was an eruption from right here on Clinker Peak. The lava that flowed from Clinker Peak came down into the valley, and that is what formed the barrier. Before we go into any of the details about that history, let's learn a little bit more about these lava flows. So this is a zoomed in image of the main flow from Clinker Peak, and I want to highlight these pressure ridges that we see here. These pressure ridges form because there's a difference in the temperature between the inside of the lava flow and the outside of the lava flow, with the outside being a little cooler, so it causes it to buckle and fold as the inside's moving quicker. This gives us an indication of how, or the direction that these lava flows are moving. Now, when we look at a lava flow of this type in cross-section, I want to point out this rubble or breccia that surrounds the lava flows. This occurs when lava cools rapidly and it forms these chunks or big boulders. Then those boulders get run over as the lava flow continues, and it encases the outside of the lava flow. That rubble layer is going to become very important later because there's a lot of pore space between it. It's very permeable, and that's going to be an important piece to this puzzle. So now, 10,000 years ago, back to the history. Clinker Peak is erupting, and we need to think about what was going on 10,000 years ago in this area. This was the end of the last major ice age in this area, and where we are right now in the Squamish Valley was filled with roughly 1,000 meters of ice that extended all the way up north past Whistler. And a ton of this ice sheet extended into the Rebel Creek Valley. As the eruption occurred, lava came down, came in contact with that ice, and cooled really rapidly. And then it started to solidify, and more lava stacked up behind it. That lava stacked up and filled the valley that existed here prior to the eruption. Once it filled the valley, you have all this lava there. Then fast forward 10,000 years, the ice sheet has melted, and we've had 10,000 years of rain and snowmelt that have collected behind the barrier. So I want to point out that these lakes were not here until this eruption occurred. So for us to better understand what's going on in this system, we can look and we can see, oh, superficially there are lava flows that we can look at, we can walk around and look at them, but we don't know what they look like underneath the surface of the water. So, like any good geologist, we went paddleboarding. But this wasn't just for fun. I had a sonar system attached to the front of my paddleboard with a sensor on the tail fin. This sensor would ping off the bottom and give us depth readings. Using those depth readings, we can make what's called a bathymetric map, or a map of the underwater topography. Then we can use that to interpret where the lava flows are. In order to gather enough data to make one of these maps, I had to paddleboard back and forth across the lakes, essentially mowing the lawn. I'd do like concentric circles or transects back and forth, making sure that I had covered enough of the bottom so that we had enough data. Luckily, I didn't have to do this for the 10 square kilometers of Garibaldi Lake. My mentor, Dr. Steve Horne, got a grant in 2013 to map the Big Lake using a boat. So what I was actually mapping is just the nearshore area of Garibaldi Lake, where we expected to see lava flows and wanted more refined detail, and then Lesser Garibaldi and Barrier Lake, two lakes that had never been mapped before. So what I'm showing you here is basically everywhere that I paddleboarded over the course of 3 days. Using this data, we use the software program called Reef Master that takes that data and compiles it together and makes bathymetric maps. So here, I present to you the bathymetric map of Garibaldi Lake. I'd like to point out the depth scale here. So the depth in red is 270 meters deep. The purple is more in the 100-meter range, and as we get into the blues and lighter blues, that's in the 30 to 10-meter range, with the edges of the lake being 0. Keep that in mind because that same depth scale is consistent across all the maps that I'm going to show you. So now, let's check out what's going on. When we look at just Garibaldi Lake, we can see the lava flows on the surface, and we can see what looks like a lava flow under the water. I've dotted it here in white, and we're like, okay, this looks like a lava flow. But how do we confirm that this is actually a lava flow? This is where my refined mapping comes in. So, remember those pressure ridges? We can see them here on the shore in the surface, and when we look at the bathymetry, we can see these undulations in the depth that correspond with those same pressure ridges. So we can say, okay, for certain, this is a lava flow. If you've ever been to Garibaldi Lake and camped up there, you've probably been near the Battleship Islands. The Battleship Islands are just partially submerged pressure ridges where the lava flow is descending below the depths of the lake. So what does this mean when we zoom out? We can see that this lava flow is damming the lake. It serves to hold back the majority of the water in the lake. So just a reminder, this lake was not here until this lava flow came and impeded it, and we now have like a 270 meter deep dam face that's holding it up. Now, let's check out what's going on in the smaller lakes. So, in Lesser Garibaldi Lake, we can see again some undulations in the depth that correspond with a couple undulations in the surface topography. We can interpret those to be pressure ridges. In Barrier Lake, we're not seeing the same pressure ridges, but we do see this really steep depth on the edge that's right on the edge of this lava flow here. So now we know where the edges of the lava flow are in these lakes, but it seems a little puzzling why there's these two big basins here. Why didn't the lava continue moving into those basins and fill that area in, like we would expect? When we use Google Earth to do a magic little flyby of this area, we can see that not only are there those basins in the lakes, but there's big depressions in the surface topography. Why didn't the lava flow keep coming down here and fill in this big area, or this big depression here? Now this is where I think ice is involved. So let's think back to right when this lava flow is starting to erode. It comes down and it comes in contact with the ice sheet. As it hits the ice sheet, it's beginning to melt the ice. I think it's possible that ice could have come and, or lava could have come and melted the ice at an oblique angle, which would then detach a part of the lava flow, or a part of the ice sheet, leaving these big ice chunks in those depressions. Now this is really exciting because no one has ever really described lakes formed like this in literature. We're calling them glacial volcanic kettle lakes. Kettle lakes typically form when chunks of ice fall off the front of a normal glacier. They create a depression in the saturated sediment, and then that fills in with water. What we have here is a similar process, but it's occurring in lava. I think it's pretty exciting, but you may be wondering, all right, cool, lakes, but what does this have to do with the hazard? Isn't this thing gonna landslide? What's going on there? So if we remember, the bottoms of these lakes are draining. They're draining out of their lake bottoms, and that's what's causing the barrier to be so hazardous. Remember the rubble that surrounds those lava flows? That is where the water is draining out of these lakes. So along that contact edge between the lava and the bedrock valley that existed there prior, there's open space that the water is able to move through. So what we've done by mapping the edges of these lakes is we've basically determined the location and the size of the openings in the bottoms of the lakes. Using that information, we can now better understand how water actually moves through this system. We can say, all right, we know the cross-sectional area of the opening. We know how deep the water is above it, so we can say something about how much pressure is being exerted on it. And we know how permeable or porous that rock is and how it will let water go through. Using that, we can make a model to understand how much water moves through these systems, and we can start to get a baseline for how much water moves through this entire system. When we have a baseline, then we can start to monitor to see if there are any changes. Sudden changes in the system might have really big effects for the stability of the barrier, causing more landslides. This is more and more important as climate change, in the uncertain face of climate change, extreme precipitation could cause excess water in the system, cause things to change in the stability of the barrier. So it's now more important than ever that we understand the formation of this system and understand more about the hazard from the barrier. Before I go into any questions, I would like to additionally acknowledge that the land on which this research was conducted on and about is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish Nation. I feel truly grateful to have had the privilege to spend time up there and to learn and work in that beautiful, beautiful landscape. I'd also like to thank my mentor, Steve Kwan. From drones to paddleboards to hours spent poring over files, this project would not have been possible without him. I'd like to thank the BC Parks for permitting us to conduct this research in the provincial park and for letting us stay in their very nice ranger's cabin. And I would also like to thank Madeline Martin, who presented her Keystone on Garibaldi Lake here last year, and her work was influential in setting the stage for this work. I'd like to thank you all for being here. Any questions?
Time for a couple questions.
Yeah, Nate.
So given all the information that you have surrounding, I guess, like the quality of the substrate beneath the rock and the area and the amount of water that's moving through, is there any like efforts in place to do predictive modeling or forecasting of how the erosion could take place over like a longer period of time and geologic time scales, you're saying?
So the question is there any, are people trying to do this work already? Are people trying to start modeling this system now to understand how the stability is being affected?
Or like is there effectively like a forecast of erosion? Or is there efforts in place, or do you have a desire to?
Okay, the question is there a forecast or people trying to predict what the stability is here? At the moment, there isn't at all. Very little is actually known about how this whole system works. And the work that Madeline did and the work that I've done have contributed kind of the fundamental pieces to how you would monitor this system. And from there, you could do predictive modeling and you could better understand, is this system going to change and what is that going to do to the hazard? Yes, right here.
Did you do any scuba diving?
I did not do any scuba diving. It's cold. It's really cold water. Yeah, Haley.
Why was the deepest part of the lake so flat across?
Okay, you're asking why is the deepest part of the lake so flat? So let's look here. This big flat area is what you're asking about. This is really cool. Basically what's going on here is we think that this is where the glacier that carved this valley had made basically what's called an outwash plain. So as the glaciers recede, they deposit a bunch of sediment, and then all these little streams run out, and they fan out and make a really flat area. One of these outwash plains you can see in one of the neighboring valleys that didn't get inundated by water, and it's just this perfectly flat area of sediment. So what's really interesting about this is we know the age of the lava flow because you can date the rocks and say, okay, 10,000 years ago this erupted. And now, because we know that the lava flow didn't actually come in contact with this glacier, otherwise it would have looked a little different. You would have like a wonky edge or an abrupt edge here. We can say this glacier had receded at least beyond this point 10,000 years ago. And that allows us to start to better recreate the picture of glacial history and glacial change in this area.
Let's thank Martin one more time. Thanks very much, Martin. Our final presenter of the symposium is Samantha Leigh. If you found yourself standing in front of a recycling or waste disposal station here at Quest, pondering where you should deposit your napkin, you can thank Samantha. Let's welcome Samantha.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Do you remember the last thing that you threw out before coming to this presentation? I hope you all had lunch, and if you ate lunch today, maybe you had a napkin left over or some food scraps on your plate. Now, I wasn't watching you, so I can't tell for sure what you threw out, but for the past 4 years, watching Quest students throw out garbage has been my passion and hobby. I've worked here on campus as a custodial service worker and a sustainability researcher, studying my peers, and I've heard back that people kind of have me as a big brother figure in their head. They hold something and they say, oh gosh, I hope Sam's not watching me. I was ecstatic last summer when I was given the opportunity to go out into Squamish and bring the research and ideas that I made at Quest into the greater Squamish community. So why Squamish? What's going on here? Other than being a very convenient place, it's located right here, Squamish has been undergoing major changes in its population, and this has put a lot of stress on the local landfill. 2 years ago, the District of Squamish actually had to build a wall to vertically expand their landfill to account for and contain the mass amounts of garbage that were being funneled there. And so, to understand what types of waste were causing to this major problem, last summer the District of Squamish conducted what's called a waste audit to go through and categorize and quantify the types and amounts of waste that were entering their landfill. You can see here on the screen the results of that audit. almost half of the waste ending up in landfill was compostable waste, things like food and food-soiled paper, as well as yard waste. The next 30% was recyclable, things like containers, plastic, and metal, as well as paper products. Only 24% of everything that Squamish sends to its landfill actually belongs there. Now, this is a huge problem, but the one that I'm most focused on right now is the problem of compostable waste ending up in landfill. As it breaks down in the special, unique landfill environment, compostable waste creates two things. The first is a toxic substance called leachate, which is just the decomposed matter that hasn't broken down properly, and as the rain comes through, it washes into water systems if it's not blocked properly. And in Squamish, this means the ocean, a global resource. The second thing that happens is as this organic matter breaks down, it creates something called methane gas, a very potent and more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Methane and all the carbon waste coming from landfills is a major source of emissions for municipalities across the world. And unfortunately, those rates that you saw in Squamish are very common to uncover. I found them at Quest, I found them in literature spanning from China and India across North America as well. So what do we do about it? A large amount of this waste comes from the food services sector. And you can see here on the screen, food service waste is generally characterized by paper products, such as the to-go bag, and food waste, things that are scraped off of plates when people are done with them. Now, Squamish has been working on this problem for over 10 years and decided that if landfill waste is more than 20% contaminated, businesses paying for the service are going to be paying more than double than if their waste was not contaminated. And a recent bylaw enacted in September 2017 added a fine on top of this contamination fee that was going to charge businesses even more money than ever before. So with such a strong economic incentive, why are we still seeing the values that I showed you earlier? Why is there such high contamination of our landfill? I went into my summer research with the idea that people are confused. All of you in this room have way too many items and way too many streams to think about disposing your waste into. At Quest, I make students pick between 7 different bins in order to throw out their waste. And that's a lot. Humans aren't really good at making choices like that. So if you don't have effective communication on top of all of these confusing challenges, you're going to have high contamination even if people go in wanting to recycle. So my research method was understanding how customer choices at food service institutions across Squamish led to the contamination that I observed there. To understand this, I visited 29 food service institutions, such as cafes and fast food restaurants, each of them 3 times over the course of 2 months. I watched people throw out garbage for an hour at a time at each of these visits, and I recorded which items they had, which waste streams or waste bins they put them into, and then I assigned a variable, either a 1 if they got the choice correct, or a 0 if they got the choice incorrect, and made a contaminating disposal. So what was I looking for? I wanted to see how customer choices led to contamination. To understand customer choices, I looked at things like the waste station characteristics, as well as disposal behaviors that I observed as customers made their choices. To evaluate contamination, I used a metric of percentage of disposals at the institution that were correct, or the percentage of correct disposals. And I put all of this into a model. And before you get too scared, it's okay. Modeling is quite easy and fun. Take the example of temperature. If you want to understand temperature, this is a response variable or an output. And the variables that you will be understanding or contributing to that variable are things like elevation or humidity, proximity to water. Your response variable is temperature, but you will input different variables to understand what affects temperature the most. In my model, the percentage of correct disposals, whether a choice was yes or no, was my response variable. And to understand that, I added 4 variables describing characteristics of the waste station, such as the service type, the quality of signs, how many streams were present, and I had 2 variables assessing behaviors of the people I observed. I'm only going to go into 2 of these variables, but I will tell you that all of my variables were very important and contributed a lot to whether people got things right. So the first variable is the quality of the signs. So think about it. The lowest quality sign on my list and in my rankings where there was no sign present at all, like at this waste station. Kind of the next step up from that was where it was obvious that people had to make a choice, but it wasn't quite clear what that choice was between, as you see here. There are 2 recycling bins, but what type of recycling are they? And should you just throw things in the garbage bin instead? The third and highest category was a fully labeled sign that was based on titles that described the items that were supposed to go into each bin. As you see here, these are all photos that I took in Squamish during my research. So that covers sign quality. The next most important variable was whether a disposal was grouped or not. And this was a consumer behavior that I observed. So think about it. When you got your coffees from Starbucks this morning, you probably added cream and sugar, because let's be real, Starbucks coffee, everybody. But to stir that cream and sugar in, you used a stir stick. You had made a single choice and a single disposal when you were done with that stick. But think about the coffee cup. It came with a cup, as well as a paper sleeve that helped protect your hands, and a plastic lid on top. When you threw that coffee cup out, maybe at Quest, I don't know, I'll find out later, you thought you made a single disposal choice, but actually there were 3 items involved. And so that's the level of nuance I wanted to get to understand contamination here. Okay, so that covers, my model covers our customer choices. What about contamination? How did these institutions do? I'm going to show you a graph, and I'll break down the axes for you right now. Along the vertical axis, you can see what's called a stacked percentage bar plot. And so we have ranges from 0 to 100%. And this represents the percentage of waste items of each type of waste within each stream. The waste streams are listed along the bottom, and you can also see the number of disposals that I observed into each stream. These are the results. I want to first draw your attention to the landfill stream. I observed over 1,724 disposals into this stream, and 60% of those items should have been composted, represented by the green. 60%. On top of that, the next 30% or so were things like paper and containers and metal, items that should have been recycled. Only 10% of everything that went into the landfill stream actually should have been there. Unfortunately, I wasn't surprised to see this. I started this presentation by showing you all what Squamish calculated when they did their landfill audit. This is not something new that we're struggling with. Even more importantly, look at the prevalence of compostable waste across every single stream. The prevalence of compostable waste highlights the critical need for these businesses to collect this waste effectively and to make sure that it's properly sorted and disposed where it should be, in local facilities. Okay, so that's my model, that's my data, that's my analysis. We've covered customer choices and how they lead to contamination. But when I go out and talk to businesses about what they should do, they don't really care about my model per se, they just want to know how they did. These are the results here. My axes have changed. Along the side, I have the number of institutions that fall into each category of percentages of correct disposals. So you can see on the far side, I have a category of 80 to 100% correct disposals. This is the column I would want to see all of the businesses in if they were achieving that value where having less than 20% contamination, just like the District of Squamish wants. Instead, these are my results. Good, I was hoping you would gasp. This is terrible. 19 of my 29 institutions that I observed at this summer had 0 to 20% correct disposals, which meant they had over 80% contamination in their waste systems. This is a major problem. And a lot of this was caused by compostable waste ending up in the landfill. So I had a thought, because we can't just have problems without providing solutions. That's no fun. I had a thought. What if we took the landfill bin, got rid of it completely, and replaced it only with a compost bin instead? Now, obviously, I couldn't go back into the businesses, trade out their waste bins, and then study all over again because I only had 2 months, people. There's only so much you can do. But what I could do is I could go back into my data set and doctor it. Pretend that every disposal into a landfill bin had instead been into a compost bin instead. And are you ready for the results? Good. These are the results. So exciting. If businesses did nothing different, if they changed no products, if they didn't put up any signs, if all they did was send the waste that they were already collecting in the landfill to a composting facility instead, you can see that 14 now of my 29 institutions are meeting the district requirements for waste contamination. This is a huge deal, and I want to be very clear. I'm not recommending that we do this. We don't want to have contaminated compostable waste any more than we want to have contaminated landfill waste. They're both very bad problems. The importance here is that we properly sort and streamline the types of waste that we are creating. So that's my dream for Squamish. My dream for the District of Squamish is to have a complete, harmonized set of signs that every institution, every facility you visit, you're going to know where to throw out your waste. You only have to learn it once, maybe twice, and every place you visit is going to be the same. Quest University has a huge asset, and that is these signs that I've developed alongside people who are actually good at designing and made them. I just put the content on there. And as you've walked around campus today, I hope that maybe you've noticed, as Andrew said, that we have very, I think, good signs. You can tell me if you don't think they're any good later, please. And I've trained Quest students over time to sort their waste properly. So I've trained you, yes. I don't know if that was evident. Apparently not. Maybe you've noticed that we don't actually have a landfill station anywhere on campus. We have those little not sure bins that maybe your student friend has told you just put it there. But for the most part, we've been able to completely get rid of our landfill waste stream at our public disposal stations. And that's in large part due to these rhetorical interventions focusing on signage, as well as expanding recycling programs that are created with more and more urgency across the province and across Canada. So in my time at Quest, we had 70% contamination of our landfill stream in my first 2 years. After our first intervention, playing around with the words and removing the word garbage from our vocabulary entirely, we dropped within 4 months down to 29% contamination of our landfill. Yeah, you can applaud that. And it gets better. Now that we've eradicated our landfill entirely, our entire waste system of public stations on Upper Campus is less than 10% contaminated. Thanks. And our custodians will tell you that the types of contamination we're seeing are honestly pretty manageable. It's mostly glass bottles, people. Just put them in the glass bin, is what I'm saying. So my hope for Quest and for Squamish is that we can continue to share ideas and bring the innovations that we've come up with at this university out into the greater community. That we can lead the way, and that we can take information, and that we can share it with everybody to make sure that everybody in this community learns, and that everybody in this community is educated in how to make better disposal choices. I know it's a big dream. But the main thing that I want you personally to leave with today is that composting is really it. We have a lot of work to do with waste management, climate change, all of the problems presented to you today by my peers. But composting is the first step that we need to take with waste management. It allows us and it allows businesses to save resources, decrease emissions coming from our municipal landfills as well as other sources, and it's a great opportunity to bring a community together about garbage and educate them. For this work, I would love to extend a huge thank you to my bosses Angela and Crystal, who are here today, and also Andrew and Raul. All of these people helped me run waste audits, and without them I couldn't have done it. Shannon White from the District of Squamish is already using my work to help educate businesses and food service institutions specifically across Squamish this summer, and that's amazing. Another thank you, or another set of thank you, goes out to my mentor, Dr. Eric Gorham, who's over there, and Drs. Kim Daw, Rich Wildman, and Megan Bullock, who really helped me develop this project, and Kim helped me work on my data after pointing out some mistakes that I made. And of course, the Research Scholarship and Creative Works Committee, who funded this work. And a major thank you to all of you Quest students who have ever helped me sort garbage. Because without you, I wouldn't have been able to collect data, and data is important. Thank you so much, everybody. think I left a few minutes for questions, right,
Yeah,
Andrew?
yeah.
I will now take questions. A question right here.
Do you have a public composting station in Squamish?
So, do you mean a public composting station where people can drop off their waste, or where the facility deals with it?
Well, whether it's the facility or whether they collect compost separately and then they also use it for methane gas or whatever.
Yeah, so the question was about composting facilities in Squamish. What happens here with people? And so when you put your compostable waste into our waste bins at Quest, it is picked up by a company called Green for Life Environmental and shipped up just north of Whistler, where Sea to Sky Soils, a big composting business, they're great. They'll take you on site tours anytime you want. They actually put that waste into something called aerated static piles. So all of the compostable waste is put on a concrete block, air is shot through it, and that allows the chemical mixtures to compost the waste safely with emitting very few emissions. And so that's where all of the corridor's waste pretty much goes. Whistler has its own composting facility, and Squamish's biosolids, so like our poop, goes to Whistler. But the rest of our compostable waste goes up to Pemberton. More questions? I think right here.
Can you tell me where cloth goes, not clothing that could be given away, but ripped clothing and stuff?
So the question was about where should you put clothing that is no longer, or fabrics or textiles that are no longer usable. And I'm going to tell you, I got a lot of questions like these, and I love them. I love telling people where to put things. So in Squamish and across Canada, there are a few businesses that pick up used clothing, both for donation as well as for textile recycling. And so you'd have to look into your own region to figure out where textile recycling goes. But most places that pick up clothing will also pick up those old fabrics and make sure that they can be recycled well. Another question. Okay, Mason.
Squamish has a very heavy emphasis on industry, and I'm wondering if our local municipal waste collection system is equipped to deal with industrial waste.
So industrial waste is interesting, and it's not precisely where I focus, but I'll tell you what I know. So there are a bunch of places called upcycling facilities around Squamish that deal with construction waste that can be reused, and that's an amazing system. There's lots of places in Vancouver that are trying different models as well. Construction waste is not allowed to be disposed at the municipal landfill, and that's regulated very heavily. And so from my understanding, it is an issue because, of course, some construction waste still gets dropped off at the landfill. People like to dump their stuff everywhere. But I believe that there are privately owned businesses that deal with that in ways that the contracted companies are able to afford. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks very much, Samantha. Watching the showcase presentations every year rejuvenates me. It helps me to focus again on the next year of what I want to teach the students, what we as a community want to build for the students to experience, and for the students to share back with us. I'd like to thank all of the Keystone students this year for doing a fantastic job during this block, during their projects, and during this symposium. Let's have a round of applause for all of you.